So we are asking two questions for the investigation of the reliability of the New Testament. Question one was, do we have an accurate copy of the original New Testament documents? And question two is, do the New Testament documents tell the truth? And so last week we spent our time looking at, do we have an accurate copy of the New Testament? And this is what we discovered in summary, that the New Testament has earlier manuscripts than other writings of antiquity. Okay? We have pieces of manuscript that date to within about 25 years of when it was originally written, whereas the best documents that we have for other pieces of ancient literature date to about 1,000 years, our closest copy. And not only that, but the New Testament attestation is much better than anything else. We've got 5,600 original Greek manuscripts as opposed to 10 or 20 manuscripts for other documents like Caesar's Gallic Wars or the Iliad and the Odyssey. We have more accurately copied manuscripts. In other words, if you compare these 5,600 different copies and you look for differences between them, there's about a 99.9% correlation in these copies, okay? Whereas in other ancient writings of antiquity, it is quite a bit more varying between the manuscripts. And finally, there's more abundantly supported manuscripts with in excess of 19,000 non-Greek manuscripts. In other words, if you have your Greek manuscript and you translate it into your native tongue, okay, we have some of those copies. We have 19,000 non-Greek manuscripts with an excess of 36,000 quotations in other writings that are referring to these New Testament documents. In other words, we could completely reconstruct the New Testament if, as we, under Emperor Domitian, that we had talked about, Diocletian, Emperor Diocletian, he went out to destroy all of the manuscripts in a massive persecution. And even with him getting rid of all that, we could have reconstructed the entire New Testament documents just by the quotations of other people that were quoting them in their writings. So there is no doubt that when we pull our Bible out today, that it is a very accurate representative of what was originally and actually written at the time. Now, we're going on to question, and just as a summary here, it cannot be too strongly asserted that in substance the text of the Bible is certain, especially is the case with the New Testament. So, our question is, do we have an accurate copy of the original New Testament documents? And number two, do the New Testament documents tell the truth? That is the beginning of our quest today. Now, I want to make it clear what Dr. Sowinski is not trying to do with our discussion today. Okay? Number one, I am not going to argue that the New Testament is without errors, and I am not going to present the case that the New Testament is the Word of God. That may occur in future studies, but that is not the purpose of today's study. What we are trying to determine is when we assess the documents that are what we call the New Testament, does it tell the basic storyline truthfully? Is it fact or is it fiction? Or was it written by biased followers many, many years after the original eyewitnesses saw it, who embellished the details and the lives of historical figures? Is it accurate? Is it true? Or is it a late, biased, historical embellishment that is untrue? Okay? That is what we're going to tackle today. So, to do this, we are going to apply historical tests that you would apply to any writing to determine if it was true and reliable. And I'm going to go over what those historical tests are. This is not Christian. This is not even religious. This is just what you apply to anything. And quite frankly, these are the same things that are applied in a court of law. These are the same kinds of tests that you do to evaluate your witnesses, okay? To evaluate the evidence that is before you. So this is what we're going to look at. Number one, do we have early testimony? That's just kind of common sense, okay? I'm not sure that this is the best illustration, but if we were going to document the goings-on of what happened when we were 15 years old, you would be able to get a much more accurate reflection of that if you were making your notes at 16 and writing your document, as opposed to not even thinking about it and waiting until you were 60 and then trying to figure out what the details were when you were 15. The closer that you are, the more accurate the testimony. So question one is, do we have early testimony? Question number two is, do we have eyewitness testimony? This, is, of course, is the best way of establishing what really happened. Eyewitnesses that actually saw the events tend to be the best sources of figuring out what happened in some past event. Number three is, do we have multiple independent eyewitness sources? This is important because if you have multiple independent eyewitnesses that confirm that some event really occurred, then you know that they're not fiction, that it's not just one person making it up. And it often provides additional details that an independent witness may miss. Now, when you have multiple witnesses, okay, multiple independent eyewitnesses, they usually will tell the same general story, but they'll have differing details. And historians call this coherence with dissimilarity. We see this when we look at car accidents. For those in the insurance or the car business, you get a car accident and you have several witnesses. One witness, who's on this side of the road, sees a car driving erratically, sees him swerve into oncoming traffic and causing a crash. Somebody on the other side of the road sees a child riding a tricycle, veering into the road, and the driver swerves to avoid hitting the child and turns into oncoming traffic, and an accident ensues. They have different interpretations of what happened, but the essential facts are the same, and you can get details from all sides to get a truer picture of what actually happened. This is also important because if you have multiple witnesses who come in and say the exact same thing without any different details, we would look at that and we would say, well, that's actually less reliable because collusion must be going on. You expect them to see slightly different details, okay? I think of it as on a fraternity campus, somebody alleges a rape. If 15 brothers come in with the exact same story of that night, exonerating their buddy, there's a good chance that that is collusion going on, trying to protect him, okay? Because there's always some differences in the details in the way that this story is put together. So, having multiple independent eyewitnesses with some dissimilarity is actually stronger case for these things being true because it negates the idea of collusion. Now, next is, are the eyewitnesses trustworthy? In other words, when somebody is on the stand, one of the first things that they try to assail is their character. Is this trustworthy eyewitness? In other words, character matters. Next is there corroborating evidence through archaeology or other writers? This adds simply further confirmation of whether or not what is being said is true or not. And you guys, I think, can see now where this is driving. These tests that are applied to historical, trying to figure out if something is historically reliable, fits very well with the New Testament. And finally, do we have an enemy attestation? I talked about this last week. If my mom says that I am brave, I might be brave or I might not be. But if the people that really don't like me say that I'm brave, then it's probably something as true. If your enemy attests to something, it gives more veracity to its truth. So when we look at this, we can see that the Bible is going to stack up really well with respect to corroborating evidence, multiple independent eyewitnesses, and so on. And then finally, is there embarrassing? Is there a testimony that is embarrassing to the authors? In other words, most of us don't like to share stuff that is embarrassing, that puts us in a bad light. And so when somebody writes something that puts themselves in a bad light, that adds to the legitimacy and truth of what is being told. Otherwise, why would they include the detail except that it's true? Okay? So we are going to apply these historical tests to the New Testament documents to see if they are, in fact, reliable. So let me tell you some of the main objections to New Testament reliability. Objection 1 is history cannot be known. Well, this comes from the same people that tell us that first life originated spontaneously despite no eyewitnesses or corroborating evidence to that assertion. And I would argue that this is completely against common sense. I mean, do we doubt that George Washington was the first president of the United States of America? Or that Lincoln was the 16th president? Or that Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th, 1941? Nobody doubts any of these things. Nobody doubts any of these. History obviously can be known. The confusion is the meaning of what it is to know something. And the reality is, since we can't go back and personally witness it with our very own eyes, what we know is really a matter of probability. Okay? And that's the same standard that we use in a jury today in the United States to determine if a defendant is guilty of a crime. The standard is it beyond a reasonable doubt? Not beyond 100% doubt. There's always some doubt. We didn't see it with our own eyes. There's some doubt. There could be some kind of massive conspiracy. But is it beyond a reasonable doubt? Okay? That's the same measure that we use to determine if George Washington was our first president. Is it beyond a reasonable doubt? And the answer is yes, it is. So, historians discover past events the same way that police and forensic scientists do. They piece together evidence and interview witnesses using these historical tests. And that's why there's books out today that apply these forensic standards, and we'll have something called cold case Christianity. Okay, it's the same principles. It's the same principles that we apply to the resurrection of Jesus that we apply to any historical claim. And by the way, if history can't be known, then you can't claim Christianity is untrue. So that just works in our favor too.
Good point.
Number 2 objection is the New Testament contains miracles. Well, that's why this course flows the way that it does. That's why we tackle miracles before we do this, okay? And what we've decided is that since we have established through science, logic, and reason that this must be a theistic universe, then miracles are open. Miracles are on the table. That's not to say that they've happened. That's to say that they are on the table if this is a theistic universe. Number 3, the New Testament writers were biased. The New Testament is a biased account written by biased people and therefore is unreliable. So, the question is, does being converted and does being biased mean that there are lies and embellishment? And I would argue, no, it doesn't mean that. That's not the a priori thing that just because I'm biased and just because I'm converted and I'm biased. Okay? That doesn't mean I can't be objective. Okay? We can be objective even though we have a belief. In fact, if you think about that, if the only people you could believe were people that couldn't make up their mind on something, what kind of evidence would we have from these people? I'm serious.
We call those
everybody.
Congress.
Everybody falls on one side or another. There's the humanists and there's the non-humanists. That doesn't mean that the humanists can't be objective. Okay? So anyway, the point is, we ask the wrong question when we say, okay, we're going to look at these New Testament writers and we're going to say, before we can determine if they're reliable or not, what was their beliefs? If they had belief in it, then they're not reliable. That's the wrong question. The correct question is, first, why did they convert to those beliefs? That is the first question. That is the important question. So why did the New Testament writers suddenly abandon their livelihoods and their treasured religious traditions for a new set of beliefs? The question is, what did they have to gain? What was in it for them if this was something that they were going to make up or invent or create? What possible motive did the New Testament writers have to gain from making up a resurrection story? The point is that they didn't get power. They didn't get accolades. They didn't get adulation. What they got was servitude, submission, persecution, punishment, torture, death. That's what they got from it. And when you realize that there was nothing in it for them, and that these were like devout Jews who loved their traditions, who believed in Moses and the law, and yet they went out on this particular limb, the only reasonable conclusion, because there's nothing in it for them except pain, torture, marginalization, persecution, is that they're reporting it because that's the way it happened, because it was true. So, the final objection is that converted people are not objective. Well, we already kind of addressed that. That's nonsense. People can be objective even if they aren't neutral. The point that I want to make here is that there's a distinction between neutrality and objectivity. You do not have to be neutral to be objective. In fact, I was just telling Terry in the car on the way here that a part of the reason it takes me so long to prepare for these things is because I'm not regurgitating apologetic dogma to you. I actually go to the humanist websites. I go to Russell Bertrand. I look up the opposite side. I want to come up with the historical context. I want to find the other opposing views, and I want to see where the arguments fall apart. I want to objectively analyze this from both sides. And most of that stuff doesn't ever come up in this class. That's just stuff that I look at to make sure that what I'm saying is accurate, that it is good, that the logic is in there, that the reason is there. So,
well, and if anything, the non-believers are the biased ones. You know, for example, when you say a priori miracles can't happen, so anything that has a miracle in it, I'm not going to consider. That is an evidence of bias.
So I'm gonna just make a point on this. I was gonna make this point later, but since Terry brings it up, I want to bring it up now. A part of what I've been doing in preparation is looking up the dating of Old Testament and New Testament books. Okay, so you can look at linguistic and stylistic type of things, the oldest copies, and you can get and try to determine when something was written. Okay. Well, the book of Daniel is an excellent example. The book of Daniel includes some prophecy that looks at the different nations that have conquered the Israelites. There's discussion about the Medes and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans, and there's tremendous detail about things that are going on in the 2nd century BC. Tremendous detail. And so what happens is people look at that and they say, well, because of the type of detail that we're talking about in this particular era, particularly the Hasmonean era, the Maccabees, kind of this intertestamental area, tremendous accuracy. They say, well, it could not have been written in 600 BC. It had to be written in the 1st century BC. Because there's just too good a knowledge. That's because they presume that this prophecy cannot be so accurate and good. The presumption is because prophecy can't really happen and be that good, it must have been written over here. That's not a stylistic or linguistic purpose or reasoning. That is 100% purely a biased reason that says miracles can't happen, therefore this must have been written here. Well, you know what I love? I love that the book of Daniel was in its entirety in the Qumran caves from 1st century BC. Because for that to be true, then that means that those Qumrans, those were the originals. You know what I'm saying? I just love it. Because Daniel was there. They had 8 copies in Qumran. 8 copies of the book of Daniel. And when you piece them all together, you get the entire book just as we know it today. It's just awesome. So anyway, so be that bias. Let's get started on the reliability of the New Testament. We're going to boil down those tests to a kind of a memory device, and we're going to call it the 6 C's. So we're going to examine, do we have early testimony? Number 2, do we have eyewitness testimony? Number 3, do we have embarrassing testimony? Number 4, do we have excruciating testimony? By excruciating testimony, what I mean is people are willing to die for what they say is true. Because here's the thing, you can lie and make something up, but most people won't be killed for a lie.
But they know it's a lie.
Well, I'm going to get there. People will die for a lie that they think is true, but they won't die for a lie that they know is a lie. Okay? And every one of the people that are these early church fathers, every one of them were killed by horrible, horrible deaths. Okay? Only John died a natural death, and he was exiled for the end of his life on an island. Number 4 is expected testimony. That's looking at a prophecy, and if these Old Testament scriptures are describing a Messiah, then there are some things that we would expect to find. Okay? What kind of expected testimony is there? And then finally, extra biblical testimony. Well, I visited that first. We have already got the corroboration of the basic New Testament storyline through purely non-Christian, Jewish and pagan sources. Okay? That we did a couple of weeks ago. So, let us launch into early testimony. We're going to start to try to date the New Testimony. First of all, we've got Clement of Rome. Clement is one of the next generation early church fathers who is writing and quoting pieces of the New Testament. And Clement quotes the Synoptic Gospels. He quotes Romans. He quotes 5 of Paul's letters. He quotes Hebrews. He quotes James. And he quotes 1 Peter. Does anybody know when he is writing the date of the writings that have all of these quotations of these New Testament documents?
Maybe around 160?
160. It is 95 AD.
Wow.
Prior to 100. This is still 1st century. In the 1st century, we are getting extensive quotes of these New Testament things. Okay? Evidence number 1. These had to have been written before 95 AD because they're getting quoted all over the place in a document dated to 95 AD. Number 2.
Sweet.
Ignatius. I want to point out also, Ignatius is writing from Smyrna, one of the churches that we hear about in the Bible. And this is in Asia Minor, okay? And Clement is writing from Rome. So these documents must have been written many years earlier to have been able to be circulated this far around the world. These things are far, hundreds and thousands of miles away from their original destination. So, Ignatius quotes the 4 Gospels, including John now, Acts,
12
of Paul's letters, Hebrews and James, 1 and 2 Peter, 1 and 3 John, and Revelation. Now, Ignatius quotes 24 out of the 27 New Testament documents. And this was done, this quoting, his writing, is dated at 107.
Wow.
107 BC. So, 80. 107 AD.
That's awesome. And they had not assembled these books into the Bible yet.
No.
I mean, these were still separate letters and books,
Letters, yeah.
right? Separate, circulating separately, not condensed all together.
Although the canon was officially got a stamp at a particular time in the 300s, what was accepted as canon was long before that. And you can see that collating in as early as the very end of the first century. Okay? So, I want now to put up a picture of the temple. This is obviously a model, but this is the temple as it would have looked in the first century. And I want you to imagine something. If you want to close your eyes and imagine, that's fine. If you want to keep your eyes open and look at the temple, that's fine also. But I want you to get an understanding of this first century. And so, just imagine this. You are a devout Jew in the early first century. The center of your national, your religious and economic life is Jerusalem, and especially the temple. And it's been that way in your nation and in your family and almost every Jewish family for the previous 1,000 years since Solomon built the very first temple in this place, in Jerusalem. Now, most of the newest temple was constructed while you were a child, and portions have been constructed up to this very day. And it's been being constructed by Herod since about 19 BC. Herod is taking the second temple that Nehemiah and Ezra built. It was Ezra that oversaw the construction of the temple, and Nehemiah the walls around Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile. Okay? The second temple. Okay? Herod is building on to the second temple. He's refurbing it into a magnificent structure. And again, this is a picture of that right there. So, for your entire life, you've attended services, and you've brought sacrifices there to atone for the sins that you committed against God. And why? Because you and your countrymen consider this temple the earthly dwelling place of the God of the universe, the maker of heaven and earth, the very deity whose name is so holy that you dare not even utter it with your lips. So, as a young man, you begin to follow this Jewish rabbi named Jesus, who claims to be the long-awaited Messiah, predicted in your scriptures. And he performs miracles, and he teaches profound truths, and he scolds and befuddles the priests and the religious leaders that are in charge of the temple. And incredibly, he predicts his own death and resurrection, and he also predicts the temple itself will be destroyed before your generation passes away. Now, I'm telling you, that would have been a scandalous comment. Scandalous. This temple that's been sitting there since the days of Ezra, that is the center of your national, family, religious, economic life, would be destroyed in your lifetime. Scandalous. Scandalous. And so, Jesus is convicted of blasphemy by your temple priests, and he's crucified on the eve of Passover one of your holiest days, and he's buried in a Jewish tomb. But 3 days later, you and his other followers see Jesus alive, just as he had predicted. And not only that, but you see him, you touch him, you eat with him, and he continues to perform miracles right in front of your eyes. And the last being his ascension into heaven. And then 40 years later, your temple is destroyed. Just as Jesus had predicted, along with the entire city of Jerusalem. Oh, Jerusalem. Oh, Jerusalem. Jesus cried out. You could see the pain. Oh, just to gather you like a hen gathers her chicks. Jerusalem and the temple are sacred. Sacred to the Jewish people. And so you see all of this happen. And my question to you is, if you and your fellow followers write accounts about Jesus after the temple and city were destroyed in AD 70, don't you think you would at least mention this completely unprecedented event? Yet, there is not any mention of it. The temple and the city were destroyed in AD 70 under Titus. And Josephus writes extensively about it, and in fact even mentions that it was the greatest war of all time. Josephus was a revolutionary fighting against Rome until he saw that he was a dead man, and he surrendered. Okay? Not everybody surrendered, though. And so that revolt started happening around 66 AD, incidentally, when Nero killed Paul. Okay, while that's going on over there, this is what's going on in Jerusalem and Israel. And not a word, not a word. I think that this is a profound truth that dates the New Testament books. Because if you're trying to give an evidence for Jesus and he said such a scandalous thing as this temple will be destroyed in your lifetime, and in fact it was, several years, 40 years after he was crucified, I think you'd be holding that up to say, this is what the prophet said. This is what the Messiah said. When he was talking about, women will be better not to be born. Oh, and oh, you women who are pregnant, oh, are you going to be weeping and wailing and gnashing your teeth? He was talking about this event. He was talking about this event in AD 70. And Israel ceased to exist until 1947. Ceased to exist for almost the next 2,000 years. And you don't think they would mention something about that? To put it into context, if somebody was writing a book, and the central point of the book was the New York skyline, and they talk about the Empire State Building, and they talk about the tallest buildings in New York, the Twin Towers, built in the 1970s, okay? And they don't mention 9/11, I think it would be really reasonable to conclude that it was written before September 11th, 2001. Okay? If somebody is a sailor on the USS Arizona, and they are writing about, and they're giving you all kinds of details about who the captain was, and who the gunners were, and different positions and posts, and different areas of where they went to, and they don't talk about Pearl Harbor and its sinking, I think it would be reasonable to conclude that that was written before December 7th, 1941. Okay? Yet, the destruction of the temple, it so far exceeds the economic, nationalistic, and religious importance of Pearl Harbor or 9/11, not to diminish them, but for a Jew, this is it. it's even more profound that it would not be mentioned here than it would be for somebody just to forget to mention 9/11 in writing about the skyline of New York. Okay, I
So
think
you're saying that's so like all the pretty much most of the New Testament books must have been written before the temple was destroyed.
what I'm saying is that I think every book of the New Testament had to have been written before AD 70, with the possible exception of Revelation. It's a different book, and I don't want to go into details about that, but John was writing a revelation. He was writing furiously what he saw. Okay? A different book. His gospel, definitely, way before 70. Revelation, I am not a scholar. I can't speak to it. But I would leave that open to having a later date.
Well, and the guy was on exile.
Yes, how would he know?
So how would he, right, I mean, how long would the news have taken to reach him
Right.
on a desert, well, a Greek island?
I'm going to interject with a small history lesson because it's interesting. Several years ago, I took my family to Rome, and of course, I needed to see the Colosseum and walk through the Forum. When we walked through the Forum, at one end of the Forum, the south end, there is an arch there. This is called the Arch of Titus, like the Titus that sacked Rome. This is the guy, okay? He was the son of the Emperor Vespasian. Vespasian had two sons. He had Titus, the older son, and Domitian, both of whom would ascend to the throne of being emperor. This was erected by Domitian after Titus died. On this is an honorary, an honorific arch. This is an arch built to honor his older brother, okay? And it shows the spoils of his war and his great accomplishments. And on it is this right here. This is the Romans carrying away the treasure of the temple in AD 70. Because Vespasian, Titus was the general in charge of that campaign. And so here we see it. Terry and I, Elizabeth, Evan, we saw this arch. And I went, check that out. Oh, this is so cool. I can't believe this. Oh, look at this. This was erected in AD 82. AD 82. Right down the road is the Colosseum. So we went from the Forum to the Colosseum, and I want to point something out to you. This is the Colosseum. Started to be built in AD 72, 2 years after Jerusalem was sacked. This, and I spent an hour this morning. I got up at 6:30, I couldn't sleep, and so I started putting this stuff together. This, and I verified this is the Arch of Titus. Okay? That's the Arch of Titus. Now, here's the cool thing that you won't see in the history books that just dawned on me as I was walking around the Colosseum and reading all the little plaques that are in there. The Colosseum is built in AD 72, the largest structure of its kind in the world. Okay? It takes a lot of money to build something like this. So here you see the treasures of the Israel people being brought into Rome and being put into the treasury that is used to build the Colosseum.
Yeah.
There's a money trail here.
Pretty much.
And the Colosseum is built. It's got these giant, gorgeous limestone, marble buildings. And eventually, a few hundred years pass, and Rome becomes a Christian nation, where Christianity is the official Roman religion. So, you've got all these temples. You got the temple to Venus and the temple to Zeus. And guess what happens then in the late, Perry 1000 area? The Colosseum gets sacked. And all of those temples are repurposed into Christian churches. And where do they get the stone and the building materials? They get it from the Colosseum. They start tearing it apart. and using it to build and take over the Roman temples and turn them into Christian churches. So you can see the trail of money that goes straight from the Jewish temple into building the Roman churches at the turn of the millennium. It's amazing. It's just okay. That's our history sidebar. So, question 1. Do we have early testimony? Well, let's take a look. We've already determined that almost the entire New Testament must have been written before AD 70. And I'm going to give you some solid evidences besides the, it only makes common sense with the Jewish temple being destroyed and not being mentioned in any of the writings. So, Paul died about here. Well, Paul wrote 3/4 of the New Testament. So, at least 3/4 of the New Testament had to be written before he died. That only makes common sense. Number 2, James. James was martyred, and what he wrote had to be written before he was killed. Number 3, Acts. Acts can be dated to about AD 62. Now, Luke writes in great detail, and he leaves lots of clues. For example, he will talk about the transition between they, in his writings, to we. You can tell exactly when he joined Paul on his journeys. And so Paul is kind of the central human figure in the latter part of Acts, and he goes right through there. And now the question is, if he was writing this after Paul's death, don't you think it would make sense that he would include those details? Yet he includes the part of his Roman house imprisonment, and that's about where he ends the book of Acts. So clearly, it can be dated to around 62 AD. Also, he doesn't mention the martyrdom of James, the brother of Jesus, but he does mention the martyrdom of James, the brother of John. And James, the brother of Jesus, was killed in AD 62. So he's mentioning martyrs. He mentions Stephen. He mentions James, the brother of John. He's mentioning martyrs, but he doesn't mention James, the brother of Jesus. He doesn't mention Paul. Well, James was killed in AD 62. His book must have been written before that event occurred. Luke, therefore, must have also been written before AD 60, because Acts is a continuation of Luke's first. In my former book, O Theophilus, is the introduction to Acts. Okay? So, Luke and Acts needs to be looked at as one continuous narrative in 2 parts. Now, 1 Corinthians can be dated very accurately through textual criticism to about 55 or 56 AD.
Can everybody see the little timeline?
Yeah.
You can see the numbers on the timeline?
30 through 70.
Okay.
Now,
Can
in
you
1
see the
Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians, there is a creedal statement. A creed is a statement of belief. And the creed that is discussed in 1 Corinthians can be traced back to within anywhere from about 18 months to 6 years of Christ's crucifixion. It dates back at least to about 36 AD. I mean, we're talking early testimony here. So Luke is written before 60. Mark can be dated probably to somewhere around 50 AD. Paul, my point before was simply that he wrote all of his books before he died. Galatians probably about 49 AD. Maybe the earliest document that was written. In other words, of all the documents that we have, the earliest is probably Galatians from AD 49. As we mentioned already, most or all of the New Testament before the destruction of Jerusalem, and we would call this the age of the eyewitnesses because this is when people lived who would have seen all of this stuff going on. Now, we're talking about this creed that you can see around 36 AD. I want to talk a little bit about that. This is what Paul writes. He says, "For what I received, I passed on to you." What Paul is saying here is that I'm about to tell you a statement of belief, you Corinthians, because he is correcting them. He's been impugned as a false apostle, and the gospel is getting perverted. And so he is correcting them. He's saying, look, we're going to go back to the earliest statement of belief. For what I received, I passed on to you. What did he receive? Do you remember he had a meeting with James and Peter? He said, I want to make sure that after my conversation with Jesus, after my Damascus experience, and I go kind of into seclusion for a while, and now I am preaching the word, I want to make sure that what I'm preaching jives with what James and Peter are saying. Okay? We're going to compare notes. For what I received from the apostles, I passed on to you. That can be dated to that receiving that gospel to the mid-30s when he was meeting with them, when Paul was meeting with James and Peter.
Well, as of first importance.
As of first importance, to correct the heresies that were creeping into the church, that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day, according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. Now, here's what's important. This language is not Paul language. These are words that Paul never, that when you look at the Greek words, he never uses them in any of his writings. None. This is not Paul's original writing. He is writing down an he is writing down an old, early creed of the church verbatim. Verbatim. In other words, he didn't create these words. He is spitting out words. How do we know that? Because when you analyze the Greek, none of this are words and grammar that Paul used. He is simply stating the creed that he received from Peter and James, that he then passed on to the Corinthians when he was on his missionary journey to Corinth, and is now writing to them in 55, 56 AD.
So this is less of a declaration and more of a recitation.
This is a recitation of a creed, like the Apostles' Creed.
Mm-hmm.
The Apostles' Creed is a creed. Okay, it is just like saying, "Here's the Apostles' Creed." Okay, when I say his words, his hand wrote them down, but he did not even invent. He did not create. This is not his style. Okay, he never uses things according to the Scriptures. Okay, and there's other Greek phrases in there. He never uses them. Never uses them. And this is clearly a creed statement that dates all the way back to within anywhere from 1.5 years to 6 years of Christ's crucifixion. The point here, folks, is this is the earliest testimony dating to within a few years. Why is that important? Because what we're determining is, do we have early evidence? The assertion is that it was written by biased people, very late, who had mythologic, legendary accretions, add-ons. Not enough time. This is too close to the actual event for accretions and add-ons. These guys believe that Jesus Christ of Nazareth was buried in a tomb, resurrected in 3 days. The resurrection was not an add-on from many, many years later in late writings. It was there from the beginning. That's the point. That's the point. This is very early testimony to the whole kit and caboodle of the resurrection.
Right. Well, and what a creedal statement is a statement of belief written in a stylized manner for the purpose of oral transmission that is accurate and complete. In other words, in the days when people didn't have tablets and, paper laying around, if you had to be a rich person who knew how to read and write, a creedal statement was a stylized statement that contained core beliefs that was intended for accurate oral transmission.
Kind of like the pledge.
Exactly.
Kind of like the pledge, exactly. A simple statement,
Exactly.
very simple, not
Exactly.
embellished, but so that it could be repeated and memorized word for word and passed on intact. So you didn't have the game of telephone happening.
Right.
It was
Exactly.
it was prevention of the game telephone, so that the accurate beliefs could be passed on down in a single chunk. You know.
That's exactly right. So this is an oral tradition. It is passed on orally in the church until Paul writes it down in 1 Corinthians.
Right.
Okay? That is the earliest church creed dating to right when the crucifixion happened.
And it's so simple. I mean, there's no embellishment in it at all. It's just simple, straightforward. And there's many, many people that will contest those things. Many atheists that will say, well, Christ wasn't really killed, or he wasn't really buried, or they made that stuff up about him rising from the dead. They made that up when they met together in 330
Wow.
AD at the Council of Nicaea. That's when they decided he was a god.
Wait, so that's the point. We have early testimony, eyewitness testimony next. I was hoping to get through eyewitness testimony and then save the rest of it for next week. So we're gonna zip through this, and so So the next question is, do we have eyewitness testimony? Well, if we take a plain reading of the Gospels, okay, the writers claim to be eyewitnesses. Okay, so they're making the claim. Whether they were or not, we're going to continue to establish that. So here's Acts 2:32. God has raised this Jesus. This is Peter at his famous speech on the day of Pentecost. Hey, these guys are all drunk. Listen, they're all talking in tongues. So Peter's going to give a speech to the multitude that's gathered, and he says, God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of it. Acts 3:15. This is again Peter now talking to the Sanhedrin. You killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead, and we are witnesses of this. And again, in Acts, they called them in again and commanded them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John replied, which is right in God's eyes, to listen to you or to him? You be the judges. As for us, we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard. Now, I was going through the eyewitness claims. Like every time they said about what we have seen, what we have heard, we are witnesses, we are witnesses. And there's dozens of these claims. And not just in Acts, in John and in several of the books where they say, we were witnesses to these things. So, my first presentation here about eyewitness testimony is not only did they claim to be eyewitnesses, but this is one of Paul's claims. Okay, Paul claims everyone knows it. So, in Acts, we just studied this not too long ago. In Acts 26, what's happening is Paul is in front of the king, okay, and the governor. So we had Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, and then we had a guy named Felix, and we had a guy that replaced Felix named Festus. And Festus is a Roman governor, but the king is Agrippa. Now Agrippa is an Edomian. He is from Edom, and he is Semitic in origin. He is a grandson of Abraham. So you've got Abraham, Isaac. Isaac has two kids, Jacob and Esau. Jacob becomes Israel. God renamed him. You are no longer Jacob, the deceiver, the heel catcher. You are now Israel, struggles with God. And all of his children became the 12 tribes of Israel. Esau, who had the passing on blessing denied, it was given to Jacob through trickery, Esau becomes a nation himself. So they are brothers. They are Semitic. And Agrippa is in this line of Esau. Okay? So he is familiar with the Jewish scriptures. He is familiar and knows Torah and Tanakh. He knows the prophecies. He knows the scripture. So Paul is sitting there, and here's the backdrop. Paul is saying, look, this guy Jesus, I had this experience on a horse. I got knocked off my horse. I was blinded. Miraculously, I got delivered. This guy opened my eyes. I heard this voice, said that he was Jesus that I was persecuting. Then Jesus appeared to me, and he taught me. And then this happened, and he's going on and on. And Festus, the Roman, who doesn't know the Jewish scriptures, the Roman says, at this point, Festus interrupted Paul's defense. He said, you're out of your mind. You are out of your mind talking about all this stuff. Your great learning is driving you insane. And Paul says, I'm not insane, most excellent Festus. What I'm saying is true and reasonable. The king is familiar with these things. The King Agrippa, who is sitting there in the presence of Paul. And I can speak freely to him. I am convinced that none of this has escaped his notice. What is the this? It's all the things that have happened with Jesus and the resurrection, the questions about Messiah. Because it was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? Now he's going to start putting Jesus in the context of the prophets. Do you believe the prophets? What's he going to say? No, I don't believe my scriptures. I know you do, he says. Then Agrippa said to Paul, I know what you're doing. Do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian? No. The point here is that this is a brash and audacious thing to do in front of royalty. I mean, he is sitting there making these claims that he could not make in his defense if they weren't true. Do you follow the logic here? In other words, if this stuff wasn't going on and it wasn't true and he was just kind of like making this stuff up and he was embellishing, they would have his butt thrown in the executioning room so quickly that we wouldn't hear any more from Paul after this moment. But that's not what happens. Agrippa can't say, well, I know that you're insane and none of this is true, because it's all true. This is an incredibly brash and brave thing to do in front of royalty as he is making his defense. And he could only get away with it if what he was saying was true. Okay.
And well known.
Next is Paul claims more. Everyone knows it. And we're going to visit our creed. He's writing to the Corinthians. Remember, he is correcting heresy. And I'm going to end really quickly. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. What did he receive that he passed on as first importance? That Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures. That he was buried. That he was raised on the third day, according to the Scriptures. And that he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, Kepha in the Aramaic. And then to the 12, his disciples. And after that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living today. Though some have fallen asleep. That's a reference to being dead. Then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. That is because that meeting occurred in the post-resurrection Jesus life.
Post-ascension.
In the post-ascension, that's right. But here's the point. He makes the creedal statement, the statement of belief, and what does he do? He is telling the Corinthians, you know this is what I passed on to you as of first important. And look, if you guys need to check this thing out, he appeared to Peter, he appeared to the 12, and he appeared to more than 500 who are still alive today. You go ask them. You go talk to them. I'm not making this claim. I am not making this claim that says you have to just believe me. All the people that witnessed this are still alive. Okay? The women, the men, the apostles, the 500, all of these people. And so what he is saying is he's saying, you check out what I'm telling you. You don't listen to these bozos over here that are giving you a false gospel. You go check out what I'm telling if you need any validation or verification. He could not have made those claims to Festus, the governor, and to the King Agrippa He could not be making this claim to the Corinthians by saying, everybody knows this, go check it out. He is claiming these eyewitnesses here. All right.
Which, if we were in that position, we were trying to convince someone of something, why in the world would we tell them to go ask others?
Right.
If we know it, we're holding to this ourselves as our own little fantasy or made up thing.
Right, exactly. Well, and if they had gone and checked and it was false,
Then this wall would have
it
died
would
right
have
there.
exploded.
Yeah,
Exactly, it would have
yeah.
died. So,
I'm going to stop there because the next thing that we're going to look at is internal evidences. Evidences inside the scripture that points to its historical truth. And we'll start with that next week.
Thank you.
all right.
Thank you.
Amen.